see you all. Welcome out on this cold Friday evening. Welcome to this panel discussion. The topic, Healing the Collective, the role of psychedelics in global evolution. It's really lovely to see you all. So, could you just remind you to turn your phones off, just to start with, thank you. And just to start with, I just want to say a big thank you to, also just a hello to everyone online. Hi. I think we've got about 50 people online, is that right, Jace? Okay, yeah, hundreds. So, yeah, just a big thank you to the Psychedelics Society for agreeing to host this event for us, and also in conjunction with Brighton Psychedelics, who you can talk to more about Brighton Psychedelics at the table out there, and everyone who's volunteering this evening is from Brighton Psychedelics, who host the integration circles in Brighton and book club. So go to Brighton Psychedelics website and have a look at that. So my name is Donaldson. I'm a psychotherapist and supervisor. I work in private practice. I also work as a psychedelic guide in UK medical trials, and I'm also the host of the Emerging Purpose podcast, so check that out. I've interviewed at least 3 of you, so those episodes will be coming out if you want to hear more in-depth conversations with us. And also I've just started a psychedelic CBD event company, psychedelicevents.com. My card's on the table back if you're interested in having a look at that as well. Thanks for that little plug there. Yeah, I'm really excited to be the moderator for this evening's panel. And of course we're going to be exploring really big questions. In fact, probably the biggest question of all really has to find healing the collective. You know, what does that mean? And is it possible? You know, so we're also going to, can psychedelics used alongside other embodied practices help us move forward in a more constructive way? So, tonight we will endeavour to answer some of these questions, or we might possibly find some more questions. So, where are we? Let's set the context. We're experiencing a polycrisis or a meta-crisis, 500 years of colonisation, imperialism, and extractivism. This leaves the world in a pretty poor state. Most of the planetary boundaries continue to be breached, leading to the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, pollution, and resource depletion. There's also a rise in militarism, oppressive systems, white supremacy, mass poverty alongside extreme wealth, also the loss of indigenous cultures and species extinction. Just a shout out to Lost Species Day tomorrow. Onco area, I'm holding an event for that tomorrow. So, yeah, just a shout out for them. There's also a psychological or cultural crisis, a mental health epidemics, disconnection from meaning and purpose, and loneliness and alienation. So what can we do? Well, psychedelics have been experiencing a renaissance and have re-entered the mainstream culture through medical research, and the ritualised use of psychedelics, there's been great promise in the face of the mental health crisis. So, with a sense of hope, we're also learning that we need to move forward with caution as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. But as we move forward, we're learning that psychedelics have huge potential to create a shift in our perspectives, and it is our aim tonight to explore some of those perspectives. So, let me introduce the panel. Patel, filmmaker, co-founder of the Kundalini Collective, an organisation to support individuals experiencing spiritual awakenings. Samir is currently developing a documentary of non-ordinary transformational experiences and their implications, so check out the Elephant Collective. Marianne, thanks for joining us. Marianne holds a doctoral degree in transformative learning and changing human systems. She is a Roth breathwork facilitator and has facilitated holotropic breathwork in many countries across the world. She also co-leads Roth breathwork facilitation training in the US. Papaspyrou. Maria is a psychotherapist, supervisor, systemic facilitator. Her clinical practice focuses on psychedelic integration, and she works as a supervisor for individuals and organisations in the psychedelic field. She has co-edited numerous books, co-founded the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, where she runs a training course with Tim Reed. Alexander Beiner. Alexander is an author, journalist and facilitator. He's the author of Bigger Picture, How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World, and writes a popular Substack, The Bigger Picture. Alexander is an executive director of Brighton Convention, Europe's longest running conference on psychedelic medicine and culture. He was one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom, a popular media platform. So please welcome our panel. So before we get into this, I'd just be interested to know, because one of our intentions for this evening was to see if we could reach outside of our own echo chamber and see if there was any interest from outside the kind of the community, psychedelic community. So don't feel like you have to put your hands up, but who in this room has an interest or has taken psychedelics? Don't worry, I'm on cameras, I'm not taking notes. Taking psychedelics. Is there anyone that hasn't? And there's just here out of interest. Okay, right, thank you. So, I don't know, I feel like a place to start might be around looking at sort of the mental health, like psychedelics in mental health, because this is a renaissance in that area. And I just wondered, maybe coming to you, Maria, first. What role do you see psychedelics playing in mental health treatment? And are there any, and maybe a little bit about that, and maybe do you see any dangers in that area as well?
Thank you. That's a lovely small question.
Yeah, let's get straight in there.
Well, I think we're in the echo chamber. We're in the bubble. We really think that there's a place for expanded states. Let's broaden it. There's a place for working with expanded states in a direction that supports healing and growth. But that's not to say that expanded states in and of themselves are just inherently healing. They can be destabilizing just as much. I think most of us here obviously think that there's a time maybe for using states and tools that help us go a little bit deeper into the psyche, work with material that sometimes is quite hard to access in ordinary consciousness through traditional talk therapy. That's not to say that talk therapy doesn't have a place in that process. But it's like any tool. You can use it well, and you can use it in a way that you can have a hammer and put a nice little nail and your picture on, or you can take half the wall down, and then things are complicated. So I think it takes. We are in a place as a collective where we're having dialogues about how to best use these tools. I don't think there's only one way to do that. But there's definitely a lot to think about in terms of the mental health field. It's early days, and things are rushing in one way. On one hand, on the other hand, I think when this field matures, say in 50, 100 years' time, we're going to be looking at a very different picture, probably with a lot of diversity of opinion on how best to do this work, like in therapeutic circles.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any problem in? I mean, it's kind of a loaded question, really. Big Pharma, their relationship to the mental health crisis in terms of using psychedelics.
Yes. Well, I think we're being called to really change our understanding of what it means to have trauma, what it means to heal, what it means to work with life experience in a way that supports us to mature, as opposed to treat and cure and get rid of things. I think we're approaching things. Well, not all of us, but some of us in this field are trying to approach things from a way that is really far away from the medicalized approach that understands that something happens to you and it's problematic and it needs to be fixed. The idea, I think, with working in depth with expanded states is how can you grow around something that has happened? How can you use it in a way that's growthful? How can you mature with your wounding as opposed to find a way to disconnect from your wounding? There's a lot of clinical trials. Some of them are sponsored by pharmaceuticals. Of course, these companies would want to find a way to deliver a product that people can take at the convenience of their home at the cheapest possible way, with the least possible side effects. That is one way where mainstream understanding of these substances has found a way to accommodate them, because that's a deeply ingrained paradigm for all of us. But there's also others in this field that understand that we need to really work very differently with these substances, and they're not a drug in the traditional sense of the word, and they're healing agents, but they require a lot of presence and participation and active working through. These journeys are an ongoing process and engagement with psyche, as opposed to one of treatment cure.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking that in Ali's book, there's your concept of is it Moloch? Is there something you could say about that might relate to that?
Yeah, not my concept, but a concept that Allen Ginsberg, the poet, came up with, and then an essayist called Scott Alexander linked to our economic system. So Moloch is this Canaanite god that people used to sacrifice their children to. So basically, it's a god that asks you to sacrifice the most valuable thing you have for material success. And Scott Alexander made the argument that you can sort of personify capitalism, but not just capitalism, almost the entire system and incentive structure that we live under as this god, right? Which is quite a useful exercise because it's kind of extractive and sinister and predatory. So when I think about kind of psychedelic pharma, it's complicated, but I think the deeper issue is that the incentive structures that we live under force us, this is the Moloch, this is the game theory, they force us to make decisions that go against our values. Because the game itself exists purely to extract profit, and actually really it's just focused on things, right? So it's a materialist mindset. And I think that plays out in the mental health crisis, and I think it also plays out in the issues around psychedelic pharma, because the incentive structure says, the incentive structure says sell people as many drugs at the highest price possible all the time. That's the incentive structure. What came up for me as Marie was talking is we had a breaking convention, which everyone should come to in April next year. At breaking convention one year we had Peter Gasser, who is a Swiss therapist, and they have been working with psychedelic therapy legally and actually on people's health insurance for a number of years. But he said that really to do the work well, they're all working at a loss, because you can't simply, it doesn't fit into a system where there's this kind of robotic understanding of like, right, you do this, then you're healed, it's 6 hours with 2 therapists, and then you're done. But he said realistically, and having run retreats as well, for more healthy participants, this has been the same thing. You have to be present for as long as someone needs you to be present for. Afterwards, throughout the entire time. So he said the actual therapy hours were way beyond what they were getting paid from the insurance companies, but that's what it actually is to do the work. So you have this tension between the human, connected, embodied, relational work, which is essential, and the demands of the system, which no one really likes. It's like we are reaching the end of this extractive capitalist system because it extinguishes itself. It's partly also why we're destroying the substrate, destroying the environment. It cannot last. I love the metaphor. There's a thinker called Jordan Hall, and he had this metaphor of the system we live in being like someone who's running a marathon on a broken ankle, and they've just been shot full of amphetamines and opiates, and it's like great for a while. And maybe the 1990s were probably the best bit, where I could do it, and now like, oh, actually it really hurts. and eventually it collapses, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but I think all of psychedelic therapy is also kind of linked into that as well, where we're in a particular system.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of this idea that actually, so we sort of replace psychedelics. You replace, antidepressants and give everyone psychedelics to kind of get better, to go out in the world, to be good consumers and work harder. Sort of strange, coming at it from a broken viewpoint, I guess, or a strange or distorted viewpoint. Yeah, wow. Samir, how do you think that psychedelics might, from your point, I spoke to you last week, and I sort of got this sense that when you were telling me about your story, there was something in your own personal story about how that's something that linked to that in terms of your own journey and how you were on your sort of life purpose, or what you thought was your life purpose. And then something happened to you that changed that. Could you say a little bit about that?
Are you talking about kundalini experience?
Yeah.
What's the question?
Well, the question is like that. I suppose in linking to this idea that we're all here, kind of thinking, having this sort of capitalist or consumerist experience, or of like, oh, this is life, this is the way we're heading. And then something happens, like a psychedelic experience or a kundalini experience, and how one would deal with that, what was that like in your experience?
Yeah, so my experience was almost 20 years ago, and I think, although I've taken psychedelics subsequently, ayahuasca, mushrooms, etc., I think kundalini is a bit like the description Maria made about a big hammer or a sledge hitting a wall. It totally knocks you out. It is like a massive psychedelic blast in some ways, and if you're not prepared for it, or have no context for it, which is the situation I was in, it can take you to the edge. However, and I think this is different to psychedelics, there is a kind of process that you're on where that expanded state that Maria refers to, I believe you are kind of guided through that with a kind of personal therapist, which is, one could call the kundalini experience. Mm-hmm. Now, you have to create a language to understand it, a narrative, and again, without a guru or someone taking you through it, you will create your own narrative. However, these transcendental states, there is something therapeutic. Once you go there, map it out, understand it, come back to a kind of dualistic system, you can begin to work out your own trauma, what's going on in yourself. And from a mental health perspective, what I'm finding in the group we work with is called the Kundalini Collective, which is a support group for people going through spiritual awakening. The collective understanding, when you meet many people having these experiences and who are supported through this, is that there is a kind of self-process where you can navigate your own traumatic experiences using these expanded states of awareness. If you're given a map and given direction, you can do it yourself. So there's definitely a link between these states, but psychedelics is one way into that. Mm-hmm. You can get there through near-death experiences, through spiritual awakening, mystical experiences, and when you're back in reality, if you have a map, and I think that's what we're trying to all develop together, you can navigate your own personal trauma, and I think that's what I'm finding very interesting about this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I suppose what I'm hearing you say is that it's part of your view of healing healing the collective, or coming together in collective experiences through either psychedelics or other embodied practices that sort of brings us into more of a unity consciousness.
Yeah, I want to speak to you when you're asking about mental health and the commoditization of these. I think that we have to keep these things ritualistic. So the problem is that, let's say now people can do a course to have a Kundalini awakening, and they can go to America and do a course, and they can pay $5,000. That's not ritualistic. Now, spontaneous is not ritualistic, but there's some kind of purpose to that process. And I think if we remove the ritualistic part of these processes, we tend to downgrade these experiences, and I think there's a danger there. Whether it's breathwork, whether it's yoga, whether it's any kind of practice that comes from some kind of shamanic or spiritual background that then can awaken yourself to these experiences, If you commercialize it, commoditize it, you remove something, and what you remove is actually the essence of what it is. So there's a danger that we're going to commoditize all of these practices before they are understood in a much more ritualistic sense. I think that's why we need to make sure that people understand to respect these experiences. You have to lose money, right? That's the thing. If you lose money with these experiences, it's great. If you make money from them, it's not great. I think that's the...
Yeah, it's a really good point. I often feel in my work as a psychedelic guide that I'm kind of having to secretly hold a ritual in my head in the room for the participant, because it's kind of like the doctors and nurses are busy doing their work, and I'm having to sort of open the space for the DMT entities and then close the space, sat behind some screen. So trying to keep the therapists separate. It's very odd. At least I sort of feel like at least I'm there doing that. Yeah, Marianne, in your work as a holotropic breathwork facilitator, do you find parallels in the psychedelic work to psychedelics, and what are your thoughts in terms of how that can bring about a kind of healing? Could you speak on that?
Yeah, I have about 5 things I want to
say. Okay, great.
On that. Breath is a medicine of a kind. I would say we call it breath work, so it's both medicine and it's work. It's not as easily commodified, I'd say, as many medicines that you take, and psychedelic medicines, because you do have to work at it. It's a big process to take yourself into. So I think I'd start. My work is based on the work of Stanislav Grof. He created this work when LSD psychotherapy or LSD research became illegal in the United States. So it grew out of his work with psychedelics, and it's really based profoundly in the healing capacity that each of us has. So the internal, intrinsic healing wisdom that is part of us. So he would say, and I love the way you use expanded states rather than altered states or non-ordinary states. He speaks of this holotropic states as states that move us towards wholeness, expanded states that invite us into a healing or learning or growing aspect of our own being that's naturally part of us. So those frozen parts of ourselves in relation to trauma that actually can activate and remember who and how they are. So I think there's a natural movement if we are given the support, and I think the ritual holding of space, wherever it happens, if it's intentional and respectful, that there is the possibility that healing or learning and growing can take place. But to me, the work is really profoundly around growing capacity in ourselves to be able to be with what we don't want to see or what has been really hard to see, whether that's about ourselves or whether it's being able to face into all the things you listed at the beginning of this, Greg, the state of the world. Can we deeply allow ourselves to see that? And can we open ourselves in community to really being able to see that? And to me, the breath work and the medicine work, the psychedelic work, holds this kind of possibility, the possibility to be able to stand in the face of the change that's upon us, and grow ourselves, become better at being human, in order to shift ourselves to responding to that kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose so the idea of ritual and community seems to be coming through as an important part of what might be under or needed for this collective healing. Maria, anything more to say on that?
Well, just want to say thank you, Marianne, for bringing inner human intelligence. And you know, there's the idea of what can we bring, and it's the idea of what grows and emerges, and how do we keep in step with what's emerging. Community and ritual are really important containers. I mean, we can support each other to deepen our capacity to face and feel the deep grief of what is happening around us, what we're witnessing, what we're sitting with. I mean, it's really painful to meet ourselves in the distractions that we see around us, and hopefully a community that can support us, but also hold us at looking and feeling, however deeply that takes us. And I'll leave it there, and
Ali, anything to say
to
on that?
pass it on.
Yeah, two things. And Marianne, thank you for that. There's one thing I want to pick up on what you just said, but then also just to comment on what you just said, Maria. You know, my wife Ashley Murphy Beiner is a psychedelic therapist, and she's often pointed out that, like, if the wounds are relational wounds, which very often they are, then the healing also has to be at least in part relational. Can't just kind of be completely by ourselves having an expanded experience. We have to actually work through and heal in that way. So I think that's really important in terms of ritual and community. But also in terms of, I completely agree about expanding our capacity. This is something I've been interested in for a while. I think it's Dan Siegel has this model of the window of tolerance, which people might be familiar with for trauma. So we have this, window of what we can tolerate, and if we go out of it, things become too much. We might go into hyper-arousal, so fight or flight, and that might be, anger, anxiety, needing to get away, or we might go to hypo-arousal on the other end, which is, freeze, please, just kind of shutting down. And I really think it's useful to think of that on the collective level as the hyper-arousal. We have a complexity tolerance. How much political, cultural complexity can we tolerate? And when we get out of that, the hyper-arousal is, I think, ideological fixation. Like, there's only one way to see the world, and it's this. It's like libertarianism or Marxism, which in my opinion is always wrong, because every ism is a conspiracy theory. Like, every political idea that ends in ism is just a conspiracy theory about how the way the world should work, if it was just great, right? And then hypo-arousal is disconnection, numbness, cutting off. Like, I'm not interested in politics, I'm not interested in culture, like what? I'm just going to kind of retreat from the world. And so I think psychedelics and, I'm also a breathwork facilitator, so I think breathwork's incredibly important and powerful. All of these expanded practices have the ability to expand our window of tolerance so that we can actually meet the complexity of a world which is so much more, it's not necessarily more complex than our hunter-gatherer ancestors' experience, because it's not to say that they didn't have a lot of complexity, because they did, because they were with other people, which is automatically complex, right? Other people they didn't necessarily want to be with, because you're in a group, so you have to just be a human being. But we have the internet, we have technology, we have AI that's so advanced we don't know if it's a real person or it's not a real person. We have so much, we have a very different kind of complexity in the world right now, and we have complex problems to solve, like climate change, geopolitical instability. And what can often happen is that we get out of that window of tolerance, and I think these practices can really help our complexity tolerance. That's, for me, one of the most important things that they can do.
Yeah.
So how do you see that happening? Do you think psychedelics help with that?
I think they can if they're used intentionally for that. Psychedelics are very flexible. You could also use psychedelics to really narrow your window of you could be completely fixated on one thing, which also happens. So I think the preparation and the practices and the cognitive skills that you would bring into the psychedelic experience can then be enhanced and deepened and made rich. Like, for example, being able to hold multiple perspectives at the same time. That's something that can happen in a psychedelic experience more easily, to know that you're feeling both happy and sad at the same time. Even that can then be translated, or it's called exapted in cognitive science, to how do you feel about the election of Donald Trump? How do you feel about climate change? You can use that same cognitive machinery to feel into that in a new way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, so there's something that's really, sort of, I think when we spoke, I think you used the phrase psychedelic, it's sort of, rather than taking a psychedelic and getting an idea, right, oh, this is what I need to do to change the world, or change the crisis, or solve a problem. It's more kind of meta than that in terms of it's thinking psychedelically, which seems to relate to what you're saying about being more complex thinking. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, so anything to add?
I was just thinking. So my background is not psychotherapy, but in terms of community, so we support people going through Kundalini awakening, and we did a survey, and one of the biggest things that comes out of it is validation. If you have these experiences, a transcendental experience or something which is paranormal, having a community that validates your experience is really important. And without that community, people they can reject the experience, or they can think that they're, have a mental health issue, for example. So validation seems to be in communities an amazing thing. From the ritualistic aspect, that's the other question, the other point. I would just go back to this idea. I think human beings, intrinsically, we know that these experiences are they're experiences that can take us into expanded awareness. I remember in our conversation, the podcast, I talked about my background in DJing and club culture, and I said I think the 90s was an amazing time. I think that millions of kids every week they thought they were doing something recreational, but they were doing something quite spiritual. And that idea of taking pills, going to a field and dancing all night was inherent in our culture. And for a moment that came out. So and that was a healing, it was a collective healing for generation. So I think we embody these practices, and we want to be ritualistic. But then what happened was, there was a bill that banned people dancing and then the clubs came, and then they commoditized the whole scene, and it became Ministry of Sound. So that's what happens to all of these these kind of subconscious understandings that we need to be ritualistic. We need to come together as a community. We need to go into these places of altered states and feel that we're one. It's natural. They did it at Hacienda, for example, right? These are the things that have to happen, and then someone will come and they'll commoditize the whole thing, and they'll make it into a business, and then the energy kind of goes, and it becomes Ibiza, right? So I think we know these things are important, and we subconsciously follow it, and then someone decides to make it into a business.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I was there in the 90s for sure. Yeah, and I think that's why I'm still doing the work that I do. Because it's sort of carried on through. Totally believe in it. I was just wondering, as you were speaking as well, actually, is there something about Ali? You'd mentioned technology and kind of internet and AI, and obviously, I think back in the 90s, it's dangerous. It feels really weird to say back in the 90s, doesn't it? But it's kind of a bit like there were no phones, were there? We weren't there with phones taking selfies of ourselves, having that time. So maybe, do you think there may be something in that, in terms of like phone culture and technology that's kind of taken or made us a bit more self-conscious?
So I have this feeling that it's a double-edged sword. I think it can free us. I think AI especially can free us, and at the same time, if we develop AI in a capitalistic system, Web 2.0, it's a danger. It's going to be owned by a few companies. If we develop it in this new idea, Web 3.0, where everything is free, open source, right? Then it can be something beneficial. I think all of these ideas, especially technology, have to be developed in a certain space, and that space has to be open source, and then you can benefit. If you have ownership and IP in these spaces, there's the danger that someone will then again take power. So I think it all depends how we use technology and what space we use them in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I suppose also, is there something? This is a bit provocative, really. It's like, this idea that there is an error. I mean, we can see it around us that the world, as I said in the opening, kind of, it's kind of like everything seems to be going up in flames, and there is a meta crisis. Is it a mistake? Marianne, maybe you'd like to speak to that. Yeah, I mean, it's a provocative question. It's a bit like, it's like that thing Ramdas used to say. It's like, is it, it's all beautiful, even the sort of suffering in it. Are we meant to be heading that way? Are we meant to be? How are we meant to be healing it? Oh no, sorry, I'm giving you so many questions coming at you. Can you take any questions from what I've just said?
I come from a country that just elected Donald Trump. So.
Well, there we go.
Well,
that's what I mean, the chaos of that.
But I say that lightly. But it's brought the country into this conversation. Exactly that.
Right.
Is there a meaning to this? Is there somehow a reason? We can make many reasons why this has happened, but. And I don't know what everyone's politics is here, so I want to tread respectfully, but, we're now faced with how do we talk to each other at a very basic level, and it's very deep. It goes back into the foundations of the country, if you really look back into this, and the deep, unvisited history of a country that was built on violence, basically. And on stories that are basically perversions of religion, the spiritual stories that went awry, that took people to the country in the first place. So I think the United States is a very interesting place to look at right now in relation to that question that you're bringing. And where we go with it, I don't know. But I think the whole thing about can we manage complex thinking to a new level, take complex thinking to a new level, and what will support us in that. And we're working one by one and small group by small group. It's very incremental, tiny steps that we're taking. But I think we have to hold that big picture as we're taking those steps. Just to give you a shout out, Ali, but the course that you're doing looks in relation to breath work and holding these big questions. You can talk about it because I've already glanced through it and thought, oh, I'd love to be doing that. But I think that's exactly the way in that I hope we can do more and more of, is really bring big questions into our work in expanded states of consciousness. And really critical thinking, because we can't afford to be in the echo chamber, find ourselves creating more fantasies. We have to be asking really good questions. So I don't know if I answered that.
You did. Yeah, I could hear that. It's like, there is chaos and there is complexity. And we do need to hold with that complexity and take responsibility and actually think about how we can maneuver within this chaotic time. Because I suppose coming back to that idea of about shutting off because of too much complexity. I've been through that myself. It's like you hear it go around. It's like, I don't watch the news anymore. I can't watch the news because I just can't have that kind of thing going on in my life. It just took someone just to say to me, well, that's a very privileged position you're holding there, isn't it? And it was kind of like, poof, whoa. So you've got to at least take notice of what's going on. You can't just sort of perhaps numb it out and kind of and try not to think about it. Samir.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think society's coming towards another social revolution. I think America aside, and I think expanded states of awareness is key to that. I think the social revolution that's coming is from people who will have had those experiences, everyday people, whether it's spontaneous or through psychedelics or through another way, and without knowing it, they're going to start solving some of their own internal trauma. And within those transcendental spaces, there is a collective thing going on. Now, I'm not saying I understand how it works, I'm quite curious to know, but I wonder whether, and this goes on to the evolutionary part of things, whether we are actually moving individually and collectively through some kind of subconscious to conscious evolution, where we begin to understand the nature of reality through these experiences where it's a non-material space, one where everything is connected. Now, we may not understand how to make that reality every day when you come back to it, but we're doing it subconsciously because we're bringing something from these experiences into our everyday lives. And we begin to work with our families, our friends, our partners, and something shifts. And it would not have shifted without that experience. So if it happens collectively, it leads to social change. You can look at the 60s. You can look at it was in a smaller way the LSD movement. It created social change in the west coast of America, and that fed into therapy and many things that came out of it. But it's going to happen again. It's going to happen in a much bigger way because I think we're going to be more conscious of it because we're having these conversations.
Yeah, really nice. I mean, that gives me this image. It's kind of tidal in a way, maybe like consciousness is tidal, and we kind of go. We have a big wave of it, and we kind of, oh, here we go, like we're waking up, and then everything goes back to sleep, or it's too scary somehow. Let's shut it down, 'cause otherwise we can't make money out of it somehow. Which I suppose brings another question in terms of like the collective unconscious, because there seems to be a sort of sense in the collective unconscious of like somehow we want there to be a zombie apocalypse. We want it, like we imagine that's the ending somehow. Do you know what I mean? Would any of you like to speak on that at all? Zombie apocalypse?
I would like to actually say something about that, because I think, I'm sorry, I'm going to harp back on the election that just happened in the United States, but I think that has been actually an instinct that was a collective instinct, is that it's not working. We're actually going to have to break it in order for it to change. And I really do think that at some level in the collective, that's happening more than in just the United States. But I do think that is kind of what's living underneath that.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that. Yeah, I agree with that, because I wrote a piece, I think a week before the election, that was partly inspired by the work of a Korean philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, who's written a book recently called The Spirit of Hope. And I've been really interested in the idea, I have this concept of that we're living through a novelty famine, where nothing feels new, everything feels like a kind of endless repetition, so there's a stuckness in culture. And his book's really, really brilliant, and he was pointing out that hope is different to optimism. So hope has no object in it, and also he argues that real hope is linked to despair, and it's mindful. It's mindful of how difficult things are, and it's mindful of the stuckness, and yet it's this very regenerative energy that kind of propels us into the future, and it's a future we don't know. Whereas optimism is like everything's going to be okay, which is of course an object that we know. And he says pessimism is the same thing, it's just the flip side. And so the opposite of hope is anxiety, where it's like something's going wrong but I don't know what. And fear is like I'm afraid of something. So when I was looking at Trump and Harris in that election, for me, it also because journalistically I spent a lot of time on both sides of the political sphere and read a lot of stuff from all sides, it seemed very obvious Trump was going to win because he was offering hope in the sense that you don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's a hugely powerful force. You know what a Harris presidency is going to look like because it's the same establishment energy. And I think what people really want is, in fact, they want so badly that they don't mind it being someone like Trump, is to just destroy it, like just burn the whole thing to the ground. And there's something regenerative in that. It might be misguided because we know what revolutions look like, but I think we're not, to your point, the collective unconscious, these forces are way deeper than any individual, even group of people. There's something moving through the collective, which is transformative, I think.
Yeah, it's like, I wonder if it's something about like, it's hard, well maybe back to the complexity thing in a way, it's like it's harder to generate like a sense of conscious evolution, like Barbara Marx Hubbard would talk, it's like actually you have to really work at that. It's like, and maybe part of the pain of our time is we're sort of addicted to cynicism.
I think for me it goes back to where we started, which is tolerating emotions. You know, back to the elections, back to the chaos, back to the entropy, and I think unless we develop a capacity to be with really difficult places and not act out on it, we have a really intrinsic human tendency to feel discomfort and find a way to attribute it and find the kind of mechanism of change out there. And I think in this work we're really working with trying to find the mechanism of change internally. That doesn't mean you don't act out in the world or you don't have a way to support activism, but there's a lot to be said about how do we sit internally with some very difficult states. You know, complexity of life, complexity of demands on each person, lack of community, social isolation, complexity in the world, environment, all of this crisis. I think one of the things we're really interested in the work we do with them is the idea of the field, the deepening of the field. You know, the idea that you start stepping into a place of the collective and you cultivating that place. You start growing a kind of consciousness, a kind of awareness that seems to actually get activated work. And I know the work of Chris Beish talks really well about that idea of an alive field. And the question that we're sitting with is how to be in this meta-crisis in a way that supports the deepening of a field that is in service to the collective. And the only thing we can come up with, and it's really simple, is that we have to keep stepping authentically into relationship with others, with the work around us. And that's really hard. You know, to relate authentically, you have to peel a lot of layers of who you think you are or who you see yourself. You have to step into crisis and be in crisis and burn in crisis so you can relate to the crisis outside from a place that is embodied, full of feeling and souled. How do we work with the state of the world from the inside out in our daily way of being? I think it's a question we'll find our own answers to, but it's a question we need to be sitting with.
Any tips?
Well, I was going to say, Maria, maybe the link between what you're both saying is that without the meta-crisis, change won't happen. So that internal work can only happen with that meta-crisis because people aren't going to do it consciously. So the meta-crisis develops as a shadow opening up. People begin to realize, okay, something's wrong, and they begin to do inner work. So that inner transformation and outer transformation goes hand in hand. And that is the next revolution. It's an inner revolution that goes hand in hand with an outer revolution caused by a meta-crisis that can only happen because that revolution has to happen. So the two are synonymous. The two are together. I don't think they're separate. So that's why the meta-crisis is not a bad thing. It's a good thing because change will happen because of it. And Trump came into power because people want change. They may go to the lowest common denominator for change, but he's offering change, at least outwardly. In actual fact, they want deeper change, and I think that will come.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So change will happen, whichever way it goes. And I suppose it could be, that's the part of what I see as a psychotherapist, people coming in, you know, they're kind of like, help me change. And it's like, well, change is going to happen anyway, you know, so maybe it's more about, what you're saying kind of about, let's be in relationship, you know, and maybe, let's be honest about what this relationship, especially in a sort of psychotherapeutic way, is. I suppose what I mean is that this idea of the collective relational wounding, and how what can we do with that? I mean, especially after COVID, there was a whole let's all kind of isolate and stay away from each other, and we're all on the internet. So what can we do now?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when you and I talked, Greg, a while back, we were talking about disorientation as a precursor to change, as a precursor to really transformational change, levels of change, and how do we, just what you're saying, Maria, how do we become in relationship with disorientations without losing relationship with each other? Or our own center, how do we learn to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing while we move through whatever the change is, because honestly, I don't think we know what's on the other side of this. I mean, I think we're looking into a future that doesn't, there's not a picture of this future. But if we lose contact with each other, first of all, lose contact with ourselves. If we can stay in contact with ourselves, if we can stay in contact with each other, and learn how to do that with some kind of tenacity, the hope, I hope, is a little clearer at that point.
Yeah, I was just thinking about ritual as well as how that links to this question, because I think what we're really bad at in the West is collective ritual to process pain, which is needed to open the space for something new to happen. And I think, so in Germany, there's this nice example. When they closed the last coal mine, they did a kind of ritual where I forgot who it was, I think it was the Bundeskanzler who was there, and so a coal miner came up with the last piece of coal and handed it to him. And said this is just a piece of coal for you, but for us it was like our entire livelihood. That's like really touching, beautiful thing. Didn't cost a lot of money, super simple to do, but the symbolic value of it is so deep. And when I heard about that, I thought, why haven't we had a collective ritual around like COVID, for example, where we can but it's mad, and we just kind of went back to pretended it kind of never happened. It was the maddest time. Occasionally I just remember it and I think, that was mental, really crazy. So we don't have the social cohesion to actually go, do you know what? We need to process everything that happened. We need to really have an honest conversation about it. We need to go into it. Sure, they have like inquiries and whatever. The British government loves inquiries. It's like constantly having inquiries. But an actual process where the pain can be voiced, expressed, and transmuted, that for me I'd love to see on the collective level. It happens in the UK when a royal dies, for example, or like a royal wedding. So the UK is weirdly like probably better at it than a lot of countries because it has this kind of royal family thing going on. But it would be amazing if we did it in a conscious way for things that need to happen, things we need to actually process. Otherwise there's no space, there's just too much heaviness. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, just to link to what you were saying before about how to sit with the pain, but also ritualistically, I think the psychedelic experience, and I think we should define psychedelic experience, because I was just thinking, what exactly is a psychedelic experience? Yeah, let's do that. But from a transcendental experience, whether that's psychedelic or not, your sense of space and time shifts. And from what I've learned is that without even knowing it, I'm sitting in spaces because I've got a completely different understanding of space and time. And my relationship to myself and my thoughts completely shift. And that's a moment where I'm sitting with something that I never thought I could sit with. And it makes complete sense at that moment, and it gives you a sense of purpose for that particular idea that you can take back into real life. Now, that's when I think when it's held ritualistically and it's held well. But I think there is something that transcendental space, be it psychedelic or something else, it can help you sit with stuff that you can't sit with normally, and that's where it's important. But what's the psychedelic experience? What is it?
Oh yeah, should I define the psychedelic experience? Well, the way I would define it is it's a tool to help us see what's in the unconscious. It's very simply it's a way to take down that wall and kind of go, oh my God, what's on the and is there something I could own? Can I own my inner Trump? Oh my God. Can I put Trump on my altar? This is, I suppose, yeah, so I'm kind of joking, but I think, yeah, on a very simple level from where I see it, it would be about, the same way we might dream, in a way, we might interpret a dream or I don't know, would you like to go any further with that definition?
No.
Keep giving you very close questions.
What I want to bring in is the idea of an animistic perspective that comes through psychedelic experiences but I think we're also talking about a world that has become very concrete because the way we live our lives requires that we sort of deal with things the way they are. And I think one of the things we're getting to when we talk about ritual and when we talk about deepening into psychedelic experiences is about bringing some more animism into the world and understanding things from again an ensouled perspective, where things become alive, when things start becoming alive, then we can start relating to things. So the relational field really deepens. So we talk about that collective shift, and in my mind there's an organic movement, there's an alive thing that's waiting to take form and shape and become in front of us, and how we relate to everyday things in our world will be defined very differently if we can cultivate that level of aliveness in everything around us. I see a micro movement.
I think part of so Groff, I think it was Groff who coined non-specific amplifier, but yeah, so we speak of psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers, and I believe that as we enter into that amplification of what is living in our psyches, in our bodies, in the whole essential cellular nature of our being. And we learn to navigate in those fields. We learn to know how to open to those fields of amplified experience. I mean, I think the possibility, I'm sure many of you have had the experience where you've experienced the suffering of all beings, or we experience nature in the huge depth of crisis that we're facing. I mean, in the Native American tradition, there's we're living our lives with holding the 7 generations who've come before us and the 7 generations who are going to come after us in our awareness. And I believe that the psychedelic experience can open us who have not grown with that kind of state of mind, that the psychedelic experience, that expanded consciousness, can open us to the actual direct experience of what it is to live our present day life with those 7 generations before and after, for example. So it's like we're growing our capacity. I'll come back to that. It's what I keep underscoring.
Yeah. So I suppose to kind of summarise where we're at in terms of the conversation. It's like it seems like we're in agreement that there's that something about a ritualised embodied practices to move forward. Something about coming together and in these states, or maybe, and not just even in these states, kind of out of the states, in the integration phases as well. But how to work in that way that creates connection with each other, and I suppose part of that, is there something to do with grief around in that? Would anyone like to speak to that at all? I mean, I certainly know in my own experience that, and I suppose I see it in the culture now as well. There's a much bigger, Camille Barton's just written Tending Grief, brilliant book, around, and this idea, this sort of Western idea that we all go to like our ayahuasca circles or whatever, and we kind of do these big experiences, and we get all our grief out in one go. But is there something else that we can be doing? Can we be tending grief? Is it a daily practice, perhaps? Maybe that's just a statement I'm making. It's not a question that I'm asking. I think we all need to tend our grief on a daily basis. Yeah, there's a few nods in the audience. So it's sort of, there's something about the collective sorrow, I think, and getting in touch with that. I'm certainly noticing in my own tending grief practices that seems to be, well, it's always gratitude that leads me into grief somehow, because it's that thing of, here we are, what a beautiful planet we live on, with all these beautiful people and these families that we have that can be quite tricky, but these friends and these amazing people, these people that I don't like, it's kind of like, at least we're still playing this game with each other. And then this gratitude comes, and then immediately underneath that comes this kind of vein of grief, and it's like, it feels like it's like everything that we love. The price of living is, is grief. Is we're going to lose it all, and we're all going to go as well. So it feels important.
Yeah. Just I'm not picking up somewhat on grief, but what came up for me thinking about animism, especially, is the importance of that being that if we see the world as alive and greater than us, then we're no longer the center of the world. I think that's the issue that we have in a lot of this, right? So the orientation that we've had since the Enlightenment, in particular in the West, is like, we're the center of the world. We're, a humanist perspective where human flourishing and insight is the most important thing. The world around us is kind of a dead machine that we can tinker with. And in some ways that was a very, important thing to go through, and it's brought a lot of good. But I think we are moving to this mode where we are moving in some sense, and I think expanded experiences and psychedelics can bring us here, where we suddenly realize, oh, it's actually, the world is not just us. The world is much bigger than us. And I always cringe when I think about the phrase changing the world that humans say, because I'm like, well, but we're not the world. Like, you're going to change the willow trees? And like, right, willow trees, we've got a better way for you to be a tree, right? But what human beings do is change culture. And so I came across a really good definition of culture by Seth Godin recently, which is a 7-word definition, which is people like us do things like this, which is brilliant because it works for every kind of culture. And I'm really interested at the moment in what are the capacities that these experiences have to really change things. And I think if we orient it towards, well, we can change culture as human beings. We can change what people like us, who they are, and the things we do. And I think the point about animism is vital, because if we think it's our job to change the world, then we're in this narcissistic, hubristic view. But if we recognize that our job is actually to change culture, which is how we relate to one another and the things we do, then I think the question becomes a lot easier. And transformation becomes easier as well.
Yeah. So perhaps that becomes more about the conversations that we can have around sadness or grief, or can we, going back to the sort of relationality, it's like, can we be soft with each other? Can we be vulnerable? Can we like move closer in and kind of unfreeze those? I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? When we think about sort of materialist viewpoint, and it's like we are, like machines, but we're in the machine and we are part of that. And actually, I suppose this brings us to the nature of consciousness now, doesn't it? Should we bring the nature of consciousness into this discussion? I think we should. I think it's about time. Yeah. So, so there's this sort of old, obviously, idea of like kind of consciousness arising out of. Sorry, hang on, get this right. Consciousness arising out of matter. And what we're seeing through quantum physics really is it's sort of like being flipped, right? It's like matter has created consciousness. What are your thoughts on that? I agree.
Okay, so
and how might that viewpoint help us in the sort of global evolution?
Well, okay, so
or can it?
I think just to unpack that a little bit. I think so from a mystical experience space, or a non-dual space, or kundalini awakening, or psychedelic, if you have a non-dual experience where you feel everything is one, and it transforms you, you can't come away from that thinking there's a materialistic framework to reality, because you have experienced a quantum entanglement, the idea that all things are connected, and you have this unfailing belief that everything is interconnected. You can't, even though you have to live in the dualistic world, it can be quite painful. It's so the only framework that backs us up is that everything is connected, whether it's consciousness or quantum information, as some scientists think. Mm-hmm. And it could be the same thing, or Brahman in the Hindu scriptures, or Shunyata, I guess, emptiness in Buddhism, or the word in Christianity. Let's say there is a fundamental matrix that connects all things, and we tend to perceive it in the three-dimensional, four-dimensional space-time. Now, when you move past that and you understand that everything is connected, a lot of things begin to make sense. So all these experiences, precognition, premonition, clairvoyance, telepathy, even the seeing of lights in the sky, all of these things make sense in that framework. So 100%, I think you can say it's consciousness. I think consciousness itself has to be defined. What is consciousness? Are we saying that all things are consciousness? I think the consciousness itself has to be understood. But as a framework, we have to let go of this idea that everything's materialistic. And I think that many people in the science professions are beginning to look at consciousness as the key to everything. If we can't define the world unless we understand what consciousness is. They call it the hard problem of consciousness. And I think some scientists are beginning to understand, and quantum physicists, even like Bohm and Schrödinger, said that it was consciousness that collapses the wave function. So the universe is a set of possibilities. We observe it, we collapse that possibility into one situation. And the original quantum physicists believed it was consciousness. It's our consciousness that's creating reality, or co-creating reality. Now, I think we can have real social change if we realize that all our actions have repercussions, that everything we do is interconnected. It's a very difficult thing because at the source of all our trauma is separation, or grief, as you said.
Yeah.
And that's the issue, isn't it? Because we think we're separate, and we keep thinking we're separate, but actually these experiences tell us we're not separate, we're all connected. But when we go back to reality, we have to exist in a dualistic framework where we think we're separate.
Yeah, so where do we go from here? Where I feel like, you know, we've kind of, I mean, there's a lot to speak about, isn't there? And I suppose I'm still want to come back to that question. It's like healing the collective. Is there I know there's not one answer to it, but what do we need? What we need as a collective? We've talked about rituals, and perhaps that can help us. That helps with the mental health crisis, and therefore, if we're sort of doing our mental health work in terms of coming together and creating connections and being more vulnerable with each other, then that kind of also gets us to be softer and more vulnerable with the world that we live in, and more respectful. We talked, it's like if we start thinking about consciousness and consciousness, matter arising from consciousness, then that's a much bigger idea. How can that? Is there a way that can help us? That viewpoint.
It's super existential.
It's super existential, and maybe that's too ephemeral, kind of to even speak to that. I don't know.
Well, where I go, which is questions around consciousness are above my pay grade, to be honest. But I think, but I will. But what I think about is the experience that is not infrequent in these big expanded states is the experience of death, and the idea that we're finite. This experience of life is finite, and there can be fear that comes with that, there can be grief that comes with that, there can be rage that comes with that, all of that, but there's some kind of landing with the truth of our lives being finite. And then whatever, who knows what after that. But that is talk about a disorientation. There's something that throws things into perspective. And I feel that in the world where the earth became something that we use, our lives also lost their finiteness, if that's a word. We lost our relationship with death. And I think there's something in this work that can bring that back. I speak from probably the oldest one in our group, but so I mean, just getting older, we get into a relationship. But I think there's something there that could promise a shift if we can really, really find that right relationship culturally with death and dying.
Yeah, that speaks to me a lot. Like, I think one of the missing questions in our culture, and when I say our culture, I mean the culture of advanced Western democracies, that is like where I've grown up in and probably we're all embedded in, is what's worth dying for. That's the missing thing. What is actually worth dying for, which then links to what's worth living for. So we have what John Vervaeke has called this crisis of meaning. What exactly are we doing? There's no real clarity, because consumerism, is not fulfilling. It might have been briefly in the 1950s when it was like, amazing, get a suburb and get a car, and then obviously very quickly we realize there's a really deep spiritual emptiness to that. And I think death is a big part of it, but I think also talking about healing the collective, that, you know, we have to recognize we have a particular grammar of thought and understanding in the West, and our spiritual experiences are prophetic, which is a term Rick Strassman, who did the first study of the psychedelic renaissance on DMT. He uses that word to describe the kind of religious experiences people have in the Bible. And it's a really important thing to understand, because the experience that Moses has, speaking to a burning bush, is quite different to the experience that Buddha has, kind of dissolving into and recognizing, well, in some ways there's similarities, but it's very different to have a mystical experience where you have a sense that you are embedded in history and you're receiving divine energy that's going to direct you forward. And all of our religions in the West, and in fact Buddhism as well, came from this period that's known as the axial revolution. So we moved from a lot of understandings of the world which were cyclical and sort of, you know, everything is in big cycles and everything's sort of interconnected, to you have Judaism, which is like, oh no, there's a God that can help us get out of the cycles of history and move us somewhere forward. And then even Buddhism is like that. It's like we're stuck in the samsara, but there's a way to actually break the cycle and in that sense move forward. So we've had this like a couple thousand years of a way of seeing the world which is based on progress and moving forward. And we might be moving away from that, but my sense is that we need some way to move into a new paradigm that recognizes that we understand change through progress. Like, we need to move somewhere as a culture. Like, we need to go somewhere. And then that links back to this idea of hope. Like, we don't know where it is. Like, I think going somewhere where we think we know where it is, that's a real problem. That's an ideology, and that's the 20th century, was that. It's like, this is... But for me, I think that really comes up for me, and I think death is really linked to that, because that's the one place we know we're going. Like, for sure. So, yeah, it's something powerful in it for me.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. Do you think there's something that the indigenous cultures can teach us about our relationship to death? Maria?
Well, a relationship to death, but also a relationship to the ancestral realm, which again I think we've missed, was really moving to tune into the news very briefly today and see that there's a really important national conversation around assisted dying, and bringing a conversation that's so complex, so difficult, and we go back to how can we hold the enormity of this complexity as opposed to get fixed to certain positionings and ideas, and how can we hold it all in mind and in heart together. So I guess for me what matters from this and from what you bring here is the distance from the process of death, of dying, and therefore the distance we have culturally from the processes of change and letting go. If we are a culture that doesn't witness or incorporate or accept death and dying, then we have a real issue with the general forces of change in the world and inside of us. So ancestral indigenous practices also have a real rootedness to an understanding of the ancestral realm and our interconnectedness with the 7 generations behind and the 7 ahead, and they broaden the field of existence into a more systemic echo. Let's bring echo when we bring systemic, let's bring the ecosystemic view that allows us to be located within a much wider field of force, a much wider consciousness that's not necessarily located into the body, but it's located to everything we are in any kind of relational exchange with. How do we bring death back into our conversations, our awareness, our practices? You talk about grief tending practices. And then I guess around death there's also the idea in change, the idea of initiation. You know, we have rituals, but we also have rites. And rites is another thing that in Western culture has fallen out of step. We have fallen out of step with. And we're left to initiations of the heart, like grief or love. These are the forces that now come and initiate us and change us into a deepening maturity into the world, into how we are, how we are shaped, how we turn up into the world around us. But these things are left a little bit to chance. So it goes back, I think someone was saying about, do we have okay, there's a ritual, but is there also a coming of age that we need to start holding space for? Is there we have things like marriages, divorces, we have some kind of rituals around these things, but what about rites of passage and the idea that we're maturing, and with that an awareness of death and dying comes into that, we can start having national conversations like today about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I suppose also that it's like how to have those conversations, right? It's like I was kind of thinking, is it something about telling stories? This idea that we've been sitting around fires for since the beginning, telling stories, and we've kind of. Now we've got like the sort of flashing box in the room that is our fire, and we sit and look at that, and it tells us stories, or we're kind of given. But so there's something about coming back into the circle and sharing that, and maybe, it's very beautiful way to describe it. Thank you. It's actually it's something about the kind of going round, the realizing we're here and then we're gone, and how do we describe that to each other and hold that.
Yeah, I'd just like to say one thing, kind of circling right back to the very beginning, Maria, when you spoke about how we're holding the space in which psychedelic work happens, or in expanded state. Who are the people who hold the space? What is the attitude of the people? Because I think, yes, there's the session, but there's the preparation for the session, there's the holding of the session, there's the integration. And the quality of being that accompanies those who are, whether it's a group or individuals in the session. So I think, how are we midwifing, in a way, this work into being, and who are the people, how are we training the people who are doing that work? How are we learning together how to hold that space? And I think it's whether we're actually holding space for literally people who are working with psychedelic work, or how are we holding spaces in which people are opening themselves through, I think of childbirth as a huge place where expanded states happen, and how do we move from the medical model of childbirth, which has happened, and death and dying, etc., etc. So I think, how are we training those who accompany the people who are journeying in expanded states of consciousness one way or another?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing there is like how we take responsibility for that. We don't, because I suppose that's the thing with any sort of renaissance or kind of thing, the wave that's crashing. It's like loads of people want to jump on the wave, having had an experience. And it's suddenly like, here I am, whoa, I can give this to other people somehow. And actually there's something about, I suppose what I'm hearing is like, being careful with that. Being careful about perhaps that journey yourself being a space holder for someone or for groups. Yeah?
I want to add to this idea that you both mentioned about 7 generations in the past and the future. I think that what's making this particular time interesting in the history of the world is that we're holding space across different cultures. So we are mixing these wisdoms and these energies, which we never used to do before. So we're not only holding space for ancestries that are our own, because we're mixing, we're diversifying, we're mixing cultures, we're holding for ancestries that are not our own, from different cultures. And I think that diversity of, let's say, cultural, spiritual energies is creating this new experience. And the psychedelic community, if you're British and you do ayahuasca, you've got your own ancestry. And you're going and you're doing something in South America which has this indigenous ancestry. With me, I had a kundalini awakening in the UK, but there was something quite Western we spoke about earlier on, about the descent of grace. I felt a descent, and kundalini is also up the spine. There's something going on which is cross-cultural, and I think it's unlocking things in us collectively, as it's meant to, which you couldn't have had happen before, because these kind of cultural wisdoms were not available to people outside that culture. And so that's what's key to happen today. There's a collective awakening happening, because it's the cross-collateralization, I'm saying that correctly, of all of these energies, and it's doing something new, and it's mapping something new about us, and I think that's where the evolutionary thing is coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking, so before we go to our audience for questions, is there something left over, something to say on this topic before we open it up? Is there something that needs to be said? I'm sure it will get said. Okay, should we open up for questions? Yes, we've got about half an hour now to if there are any questions. I think it's quite a small room, so if you just want to put your hands up, we can kind of if you shout out your question, and then I'll repeat it for the people online. So you put your hand up first, yeah.
Yes, so I wanted to ask about transformation. So you also talked about rituals and...
Actually, I think we'd better have a mic. Should we take the green mic over Joss, who's got the longest cable? Sounded like it was going to be a long question that I wouldn't be able to repeat.
I'm going to try to for you. Okay. So, I'm thinking about integration mainly. I talked to an ayahuasquero in the Amazon once that told me that he believes that the deepest transformation happens at a subconscious level, and it can only happen in a subconscious level. And you talked a lot about rituals and community and really inviting transformational forces of change consciously. So I'd like to know what you think, anyone on the panel, how much of someone's transformation is conscious and how much of it happens at a subconscious level?
That's my question.
Pass it to Roger. Well, yeah. So let's, anyone want to speak to that? So it was basically like how much of the work is done, needs to be done unconsciously.
How much integration can be done consciously and how much of it happens subconsciously?
Okay. Yeah.
I'll start off, but I think it's all the above. I would hesitate to quantify how much, but I think to me integration is something that's cyclical, and so there's a process that's probably already happening in the session anyway. That is, we're finding. So let me back up a bit. I think an enormous amount happens at a somatic level, at a level in the body that is prior to cognitive thought. My personal belief. I think that we are meaning-making creatures, and I think there's great value in finding ways to create meaning, and that may not always be through logic or deduction, but that it could be through forms of expression or movement. So I think art and poetry and forms that actually access the less structured part of our consciousness, and accessing those, and ritual processes can very often support that. You know, we're in a kind of still altered state of consciousness in rituals that follow up. So, for example, if you had flower baths after your session, the ayahuasca, I think all of that can help land the experience. And it's not making meaning, but I think at some point we have to bring ourselves to some form of reflection that can understand how we are different because of what we've been through. So I don't know if that comes anywhere near an answer to your question. So I think it builds on itself, and I think the more familiar we become with our transformative process, the more we can support our own journey from the unconscious into the conscious, and the expression of that change.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's I think it's useful in some ways, but I think both are always happening. I always talk about the sort of active and passive integration. There's some things which are very, potentially even very practical, like I want to have that conversation with my mother, or I want to do this, or I want to eat more healthily. I would say that's like an active integration. And then there's aspects that a year and a half later you suddenly go, oh my God, I know what that was about, and that seems to be out of control. But I think in a way that they're so intricately linked, and I think what I found personally important, and from working with people, is that discernment is the key word, which, funnily enough, the word crisis comes from the Greek word that kind of means discernment as well, right? So this moment of discernment is required. But there's a sense in which, after a big experience, I think we have to be in a deep space of curiosity and discernment to say, okay, well, what can I right now sense needs to evolve? And it's often many different things. And I think when you speak to, people describe their healing journeys, they're never like, it was that one breathwork session that completely fixed everything. They're like, no, it was breathwork, it was therapy, it was this, it was a walk in nature, it was a conversation I had with a stranger, it was this, it was that, it was art, it was... So there's a kind of swirling, complexity, but I think the most important thing is the discernment, to really be curious about, okay, what's actually going on.
I'll say one thing that I repeat every time I talk about integration, and it's someone else said. So I had a dear friend give a talk for our structures on biodiversity and biopiracy in psychedelic spaces and with plants. And she said, she finished her talk saying, integration is an act of reciprocity towards the plant. So if the plant allows you to really access something that is of value, it is an act of reciprocity to sit with it and really grapple with it and see how you can let it flourish inside you. And I would say that it's also an act of reciprocity towards our psyche, because our psyche is also active in this process. So there's something about deciding how can you be in reciprocal relationship to these forces inside of you, and what does that mean for you? For different people at different times, it means different things. It's a very big word, but I like how she brought that aspect into that practice. Andrea Langlois, not mine.
Roger.
First of all, thank you so much for your intelligence and your imparting of your knowledge this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating. I just want to say thank you. That's not the question. I too grew up in the rave culture of the 90s. I didn't know Greg then. That happened more recently. But I remember being there and my eyes awakening and thinking, it's okay. The generation of the 60s are going to come into power like in about 10 years' time or 20 years' time, and they're going to sort it out. And now, with over 30 years of psychedelic experiences behind me, in the present moment, well, not quite in the present moment, let's be clear, microdosing on DMT is where I've ended up, and again, I'm very grateful for finding that. And for me, it's a meditational experience. I absolutely love what you were saying about ritual and community, but for me, it's a private meditational experience, and that is my own ritual that I fell into. But my question is, where the hell did it go wrong, and what can we do that is different this time? If this is a psychedelic renaissance, and I get it that this is that term is a psychiatric term, in the psychiatric community, and I use it in that kind of with that kind of respect. But knowing what we know now, knowing from my own experience that, it's going to sound corny, I aspire to be an angel. And I take that term, my semantic is back from Christianity to say, I'm going to have that. I am going to be an agent of positive change. And that's my definition of that. And strangely, most days I achieve it. How can I, if it can happen to me through my experiences, why can't it happen to everyone? And how has that not happened already? Where did we go wrong, or where did they go wrong? And what can we do this time that's different?
Thank you, Roger.
Okay, that's a big question. I'm going to try and answer it from my own perspective. So the first thing is, I don't think anything's gone wrong. I think from the perspective that I've experienced, I think everything is how it's meant to be. We are in a process. The process requires crisis. Now, from an individual perspective, you may say, okay, I'm seeing problems with the world. But from a collective experience, change is happening. It might not be happening at the pace we want, but it's happening as it should be. In terms of, I think you talked about where did it go wrong. Are you talking about politically or socially or just everything?
Where did it go wrong?
I think the most important key thing.
What can we do to do it differently this time?
Yeah. Okay, so
If this is a renaissance, and I do agree with that, I do see that in consciousness. How can we do it that's different from being in strawberry fields forever?
Right. Okay. So that's a good point. Okay. So unlike the 60s, unlike the 90s, I think we need to work on we need to recognize that all these experiences are about healing our own trauma. So raving in the field in the 90s was an inefficient but quite a fun way to heal some trauma, and I think many people who popped pills to MDMA had some kind of healing, parting with people that they would never have socially parted with before. It crossed cultures, across boundaries, across genders. But now we have to be aware of that process. We have to understand that, okay, these experiences are actually meant to be ritualistic, meant to be healing, and we have to go into the spaces that we were very uncomfortable with, to go and those hugely uncomfortable spaces. We have to do it individually and collectively, and be aware of what we're doing. We have to do it organized and also in a way which is, let's say, I'm not going to say uncapitalistic, but let's say not purely for profit. We have to create structures around it, again, individually and collectively, to help us and other people hold these shadow spaces and heal in the shadow spaces. So if we can begin to understand what is actually happening, while we're doing it recreationally in the past, but it's not recreational, it's ritualistic, it's important, it's evolutionary, then we begin to understand that there's a purpose to all of these journeys, and then we can put it in perspective. So what I'm talking about is mapping these experiences and understanding what it means to have these experiences within the context of a species. And I would suggest that we have a collective consciousness. We're not individual. When we have transcendental experiences, we're going into the collective. And that collective is a collective not just of humans, but of everything. If we can understand that, and then understand what are we bringing down from these experiences into our individual life, and how is that, for me personally, going to change me and work with that, probably you'll find that you're being given a way to heal your own trauma. So we have to be aware now of what's going on, rather than kind of half aware. We have to be prepared to really go into the most uncomfortable places. That's where the real work's done. And that probably means that going into places that we haven't thought about yet. And these transcendental experiences can help us understand where and how to go there. We really have to listen to it. I'm not sure whether that answers your question or whether it begins to, but I think in the past they weren't thinking along those lines. I think we were doing things in a subconscious way. Even the 60s movement was a subconscious revolution in some ways. I think we have to be aware that this is a revolution of consciousness and understanding who we are as a species and what our purpose is. That's a big ask, but I think we're getting there from different fields.
More consciousness. Yeah. Joss, you've got some just. Oh, is it? Oh, Marianne.
I just want one little tiny reminder, just to remember that 35 years is a blink of a gnat's eyelash in the grand plan of things. So I would say keep hope in that we may be actually doing a lot right.
Nice, yeah. We've got a question from the online community.
So this is on behalf of Lou online. How do we advocate for rituals to be brought into our very individualistic medical model, with our scientific research so narrowly focused on measurable factors and outcomes? If you would please.
I can't help. It's an amazing question. It's a really amazing question. It's a really important question, and of course there aren't hard-edged answers, especially in settings where the work is hard, and these fields, in order to manage the enormous tasks they have placed upon themselves, have become really defended and rigid, and find the most secular head-first way of dealing with the problems they have to. I mean, it's a practice, and it takes every single person that works in such structures to find ways to really speak to something that is other. And it's really hard because these structures have very, very rigid paradigms, and there's enormous loyalty in systems of how to do things, what is right, what is wrong, and it's very difficult for people to, from inside the structures, to speak in ways and in language that terrifies the structure, because of course these structures want to have control and data and measurable outcomes and certainty. They've been built on these premises. So bringing the mystery and the other and the unknown is a radical act of inclusivity. So there aren't definite clear ways of how to do it, but whoever has the bravery to stand in these systems and be different, I mean, it's an act of service. So keep trying.
Yeah, and I would say, having, at least in the psychedelic space, having been a healthy volunteer on a trial, I was really struck by how ritualized a secular medicalized model is without knowing it's ritual. You go in, there's people with a particular authority, go down to the bowels of the building, and you go into this like MRI scanner, and they're like, how does it work? We don't know, it's magic, go in there. So I was really struck by, there is ritual everywhere. Human beings create ritual sort of automatically. It's something. So I think one way is to, instead of going into a system and saying, here's something, like you're saying, challenging the system that's out of your comfort zone, use the rituals they already have and start twisting them and tweaking them and being psychedelic and tricksy, and then be like, maybe we could do a little bit of this, maybe there could be a slight thing here, maybe there could be a slight thing here. Trick them, basically. I think that's the thing to do, be a trickster.
I guess the question is also about how do we integrate different paradigms. We have to sit with that tension, that polarity, and see what comes out of this as we keep sitting with it. It's a really important question.
I'd just like to add, I think, that one note of hope is how many young psychiatrists and psychologists, psychotherapists, but medical doctors are now more and more finding their way in this new paradigm, if you want to call it that, and having direct experience. And it takes generations, but it's happening, I think.
Undercover shamanic psychiatrists. Not even that undercover, really. Yes, we've got a question there, but just before you go to this gentleman here had a question. Then we'll take someone from this side of the room as well.
Cool. Thank you. This was from Roger's question.
Bit closer.
Thank you. Thank you all. Really fascinating discussion. Just really wanted to acknowledge the spiritual tradition in the room that we're sitting in, going back generations of Quakers sitting in the light, working through their trauma and putting their faith into action. And leading to things such as the abolition of slavery and culture change through organisations like Oxfam, Amnesty, Greenpeace, CND. And Roger's question, how we move away from, or how we learn from what happened in the 60s and actually bring about the outer revolution. You spoke about the inner revolution and the outer revolution happening together, but then also referencing Ram Dass, the acceptance of suffering, and that's another route through the psychedelic experience. So what structures do we need in place to change that inner revolution into an outer revolution that can bring about the cultural change that we need to see? So I think your answer was on a personal level to Roger's question, but how do we take it from the personal to the global change that needs to happen?
Okay, again, I'll try and answer it best as I can. So I have thought about this, and I think I'm starting with someone called Casey's in the audience. We're starting an initiative called the Elephant Collective, and the idea is to move the Overton window when it comes to these experiences. And the Overton window can be defined as anything that's politically acceptable to talk about currently. So 20 years ago you couldn't talk about psychedelics, and now you can. So we want to move it specifically with these experiences, non-ordinary transformative experiences, bring it to the mainstream. And you do it through community, which is what Casey's working on, and I work as a filmmaker, so create content. But not content for the converted, content for the people who are, let's say, open, but they don't know about these experiences or what it means. And so we have to move the dial, just as they move the psychedelics. And we have to bring it into the mainstream, which sounds like a tall order, why would people in the mainstream want to talk about this? Well, they didn't want to talk about gay rights, they didn't want to talk about psychedelics. I know this is a weird connection, but in America, they have a UFO congressional hearing, right? And some of these experiences are fairly spiritual in nature, and they're talking about it in the government. So the question is how can we take these experiences and make them more mainstream? Well, we're going to have to get everybody who's having them to admit they're having them, put it online, validate it, talk about it. I think there was some research done 20 years ago about religious experiences in the UK by Gallup. Over half of the people in the UK have said they've had some kind of religious experience. Now, that's not psychedelic, but they don't want to talk about it because they are scared to talk about it publicly. But actually, they're having something real, or they're hearing voices, or they're having premonition or precognition. We need to, the elephant in the room, it's called elephant, by the way, is that these experiences are real. They're wonderful and they're important to express. If we all start to tell the truth, which we're having them, try to understand what's going on, make people more aware of them, then we can hopefully have some kind of change. But we have to understand what does it actually mean. There's a purpose behind it. They're not random experiences. So I would go to the belief it's evolutionary. We're going from subconscious evolution to conscious evolution. We're beginning to understand there's something going on bigger than who we are. So all this information needs to be out in the public. And I think it's getting there, and I think people are more open to it. And you may not like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan will have 10 million views on a psychedelic or on UFOs. So these experiences are getting out 3-hour, 4-hour conversations. So something is changing. And I think we just have to be part of that change, and this conversation is part of that change. But to answer your question, and okay, so what do we need to do? I think for me personally, we need to raise awareness of these experiences and start to validate them as real experiences. If we can begin to validate these experiences as real, that will start changing the conversation, and then we have research. Funds have to go into research what is going on. And there's this question about how can we measure it? Something does not want to be measured. There is something about what we do that refuses to be measured. Is it consciousness? Is it reality? Is it prana or chi? We cannot measure it because it doesn't want yet to be measured. Right? There's something about who we are that doesn't want to be measured. We get to that point.
Qualitatively, but not quantitatively. You know, but in terms of when you're talking about that like brainwave, or maybe you're doing it already, of Nelson Mandela setting up the Truth Commission in South Africa, a massively healing exercise, and having a platform that can encourage people to have psychedelic or not psychedelic experiences, to have a platform to voice that, I think that would be very powerful. I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm just going
Yeah. I think we just have to be honest about who we are. We have these experiences. If you had an experience that is strange, it may, and it probably is real, you've just been told it's not real. And if we all start to admit the truth, then we can shift the dial. And we need to understand what is reality. My personal belief is there's a big question mark as what is this? There's something strange or something going on, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. So it's kind of, for me, it's like back to that vulnerability of like how you walk in your life, right? And like, let's be vulnerable and have those conversations and walk with heart and for each other. You know. Thanks. There's a gentleman there.
Hello. Yeah, I'd like to put it to you that maybe there's been a lot of talk of the mapping of these experiences and how we can integrate them. And of course, the whole premise is how we can integrate them in order to move forward collectively. And I would like to ask your opinion that maybe we do have something that needs to run parallel to the psychedelic experience, which is the reclamation of the mythical and the reclamation of the archetypal and the reclamation of the occult sciences and the things that have been completely thrown out of the door because of empire and because of the rule of empire, that has completely demonized all of these subjects alongside spirituality and has actually made spirituality seem like an insane thing to follow, which is I'll stop there. But
so just clarify the question.
So definitely the question is, how does the panel think about the use of the mythical reclamation alongside of the hallucinogenic experience as a way of explaining the situation and explaining the experience?
Thank you.
I'd like to put in a pitch for Stanislav Grof's work. If you've not already read his work, I strongly recommend, because I think he's, in many ways, there are many people who consider him the one who comes after Jung. He carries that torch, and I think some of his theoretical work is worth looking at, because I think all the archetypal is alive and well, and we open the door to the archetypal when we expand our consciousness and to the mythical. It just arises naturally. So, I think it's in the same conversation. It's like, this is real experience. How we define it, how we reduce it through the descriptions we bring, we have to be mindful. Can we bow in the face of the archetypal? Can we allow ourselves to really open to the possibility that we don't even know what we mean by saying archetypal, and yet we feel it. So I think we're learning a new language. We're learning how to behave in a way in the face of things we don't understand. And I think what you bring forward is really relevant. And I think, stay tuned. I would say.
Thanks, Marianne. Ali?
Now, this isn't really my area of expertise. I'm going to very quickly go to the bathroom because I have 3 bottles of water. And I realized nobody else was drinking water. And I thought, that's probably why, but I'm just going to let you know that because I want to be able to concentrate for the last 5 minutes.
We're going to hold space for you. We're going to hold the ritual. I want to take us back to the feminine principle and feminine ways of being in the world, and the process of not, remembering, reinstating ways of being and knowing that have been lost because of our structures, because of our ways of being in the world that completely desacralize, devalue, and mistreat and denigrate things that have to do with feeling, soul, the imaginal realm, the intangible, the mystery, and not in a gendered way at all, in consciousness state that allows us to connect with things that we deeply need, regenerative sources of nourishment that we have depleted ourselves from. And I think we're really suffering. So really grateful that you're bringing them in to the conversation.
Okay, so I think we'll have probably about time for about another 3 questions. So one from online, the online. Was it online?
No.
Or did you want to go? Okay, yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah, go for it.
I'm just considering the kind of global container that we're in at the moment, and I guess my fear is the increase in spiritual narcissism, and what should the leaders in the psychedelic world be doing to try and combat this messiah complex, or the potential for that, whilst kind of acknowledging that it's, you know, a part of all of us because of the world at the moment and hyper-individualization.
I'm going to try and answer that not necessarily from just psychedelic, just from, I think, any leader of any cult or any spiritual leader, any leader even. I think the danger is that if you're going to profess any kind of moral virtue, you have to do the work on yourself. So a lot of people who get to the top generally do it without doing any of the work. Now that could be psychedelic, and when I say the work, I mean inner work. So we have a history of people who have got to the top, and they are charismatic, and they're very good at organising people, and they're very good at professing truths. They're not very good at doing their own inner shadow work, and that takes years. So we have a problem with leadership, and I think that could be the psychedelic community. I can't speak to that personally, but I can look at, go back to India and the Indian gurus, or go back to the yogic communities. You have people who were professing all these moral virtues and spiritual powers, and they were inherently corrupt because they couldn't do their own inner work. There were points of conflict within themselves, and they were not willing to do that extra bit of shadow work, sit with the pain, sit with their own issues, and really understand what's going on. And I think that there's a problem there. So we need a new generation of leaders who have really gone deep with their own shadow and come out of it. And they're not looking to be leaders. They're not looking to be. I don't believe in hierarchical systems. So anyone who tries to create a pyramid system or some kind of leadership at the top is probably missing the point. I think a new system will emerge where we all become gurus to each other. We all become people who lead each other. We don't have to do it consciously. And I think this new system will not be a pyramid system with a leader at the top telling this is how you should do things. We'll be working with each other in a much more fluidic way. And I think out of that particular, geometric shape of organisation, we're going to find people who today they'll lead you this way and someone else will lead you that way, but you'll be ownership. You should be your own guru. Ultimately, you don't need somebody telling you this is how you should do things. So I think we need to have structural change.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose in the therapy world that would look like peer supervision. Okay, yeah. So we've got. Let's go here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. I'm really energised by it all. The thing that I was thinking of while you were speaking was Stephen Jenkinson's work around how we're so bereft of elderhood. And I noticed that didn't really come up, and it seems to be such an important part of what is going to be the path forward with collective healing. Stephen Jenkinson speaks about we can't wait for elders. We're all sitting around waiting to be led, and it kind of speaks to what you were saying about the kind of spiritual narcissism and maybe the rise of the guru, because we're bereft of these wise elders that are kind of widespread throughout culture. And Stephen Jenkinson saying that we have to all now step into elderhood way before we're ready, actually. But then there has to be some kind of structure to train us in elderhood, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Thank you for the question. We have to have a very succinct answer because we need to finish in about 2 minutes. So. Anyone would like to speak to that succinctly?
Just briefly. I mean, I love Stephen Jenkinson's work. There's a popular theory right now, the grandmother theory, of why our species, along with elephants and one more, have menopause, because other mammals don't. Like, why would you stop having babies as an animal? And part of the theory is evolutionarily it's because grandmothers do exactly that, impart wisdom, impart information, impart knowledge. So for me, what comes up is that we actually already have the systems in place. It's just that we have a culture where we have capitalism which completely negates the value of the existing system and goes, right, as soon as you're not a productive unit in this game, we don't want to hear from you. You're in a nursing home, you're over there, you're not valuable anymore. So I think it's almost that we already have what we need, but we need to get rid of the very toxic game that we're playing that ignores it.
Thank you. So we are going to have to leave it there. I'm sure we could carry on discussing this. Oh, sorry, Marianne, go on. Last thought. Come on.
Well, I just think you had it when you said peer supervision.
Peer supervision.
But I think, why are you here? To me, the fact that you show up here and you're listening in the way you listen speaks to your own stepping into that role. So I just really wanted to bring it because I think we're the ones who are being called to do the work. And we need to show up with each other and hold each other accountable.
Yeah, stay humble.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just before we say thank you to the panel, I just want to say a big thank you to the Psychedelics Society for hosting this, Brighton Psychedelics for coming along and organising and making sure it's all happening. And I want to say a massive thank you to Jeanette Werman, because she has put this whole thing together and got out the panel and made the whole thing happen. So thank you, Jeanette. Thank you for allowing me to be your moderator, and thank you to our panel.